You think knights were noble heroes in shiny armor. You're wrong, so wrong. Forget the valiant charges across grassy fields, the gallant rescues of fair maidens, the solemn vows beneath stained glass windows. Forget the Hollywood shine, the video game valor, the bedtime tales of chivalry and righteousness, because none of that was real. None of it. The truth, the real truth about knights, is buried beneath centuries of myth, propaganda, and blood. Real knights didn't ride into battle to defend the weak. They were the threat. They didn't uphold justice. They enforced dominance. They didn't protect villages. They pillaged them. What if I told you that the very men we grew up idolizing were often little more than licensed warlords? That behind every shining helm was a face twisted by greed, cruelty, or cold indifference? That the stories you know were carefully polished by church scribes and royal bards, designed to cover up something much darker? This isn't the tale of the White Knight. This is the story of the Iron Butcher, the bannered beast, the man whose name meant terror to peasants and silence in the court. The knight was not born of goodness. He was born of power, of blood, of land that had to be seized and seized again, by force, by fire, by fear. When you hear the word knight, you imagine gleaming plate armor under the sun. But that sun was rare. The mud was constant. So was the screaming. So was the burning. So was the smell. Real knights waded knee-deep in gore on battlefields not to protect their people, but to protect their titles, their tax rights, their lord's ego, or their own twisted codes of honor that valued reputation over human life. Chivalry? That wasn't kindness. It was control. It was a system to protect other nobles from each other, not the poor from the powerful. It taught knights to be polite in tournaments, while gutting villagers for suspected disloyalty. The truth is this: knights were the enforcement class of a brutal, hierarchical world, where peasants were currency and power was drawn with a sword's edge. They didn't stop evil. They were the hand of the system that enabled it. For 800 years, that truth was locked behind walls of stained parchment and rose-tinted memory. But those walls are crumbling now, and what's seeping through them isn't gold or glory, it's rot. Real knights didn't just battle dragons. They often were the dragon, arriving on horseback to scorch earth, take what they pleased, and leave behind ruins, sometimes smiling while they did it. The truth is uncomfortable. It's ugly. It's full of broken oaths, shattered bones, and cries that history books chose to ignore. But it's real, and if you dare to go deeper, if you're willing to peel away the stories, the symbols, the songs, what you'll find is not a noble protector, but a professional killer blessed by church and crown, a sword for hire, a living, breathing paradox in steel and silk. This is the story they didn't want you to know, the story they scrubbed from the records, rewrote in legend, and buried under crusader tales and shining paintings. This is the story of the knight as he really was, corrupted, feared, blooded, and human. Welcome to the darkest chapter of the medieval world. Welcome to the armor of lies. Welcome to what they were too afraid to teach you. This is not chivalry. This is not romance. This is the truth, and it's been hidden for 800 years, but not anymore. So who were the knights, really? Strip away the myths, take a torch to the fairy tales, burn the banners, silence the songs, and look at what's left behind in the ashes. Because the image you know, that noble horseman in shining armor, that protector of the weak, that symbol of honor and virtue, is not just wrong. It's a lie. a carefully curated lie. The knight was never your champion. He was never a hero. He was a weapon, forged not in virtue, but in violence, crafted not by destiny, but by dirt, blood, and the whims of men with too much land and too little mercy. You want to know the truth? The first knights weren't noble. They weren't born in marble halls or educated in grand libraries. They were muscle, armed thugs on horseback, hired swords, given land in exchange for loyalty and war. You think of royalty? These men were closer to mercenaries. They didn't rule kingdoms, they enforced them. They weren't kings in waiting. They were enforcers of the king's will. They weren't the storybook, noble few. They were the brutal many, trained to kill, to suppress, to survive, and to serve. Sometimes all at once. They didn't wear crowns, they wore scars. Knighthood wasn't some spiritual awakening. It wasn't a divine anointment. It was a promotion, a grim acknowledgement that you could kill well and kill often. You didn't become a knight because you were good. You became a knight because you were useful, because you bled for the right lord, because you obeyed, because you crushed someone else's rebellion or burned someone else's village or dragged some trembling peasant out of their hiding hole and threw them in the mud. And for that, they gave you land, a title, a sword with your name on it, and maybe, if you were lucky, a patch of ground to die on that wasn't soaked in someone else's blood. The stories will tell you they upheld chivalry, that they protected the innocent, that they lived by a code. But the code of chivalry was never written for peasants. It wasn't there to stop cruelty. It was there to manage it. It was a club for the elite, a way to say, we kill each other with rules, not like the common savages. It didn't protect the poor. It protected the powerful from each other. Knights could raise a village and still be called honorable as long as the village belonged to the other lord. They could slaughter unarmed men and call it justice as long as they shouted the right name while doing it. And not all knights were equal. Not even close. The glorious image of the shining knight in full plate on a polished warhorse, that was the top 1%, the elite of the elite. The rest, they were cannon fodder with chain mail, gristle for the grinder, men with patched armor, borrowed horses, and swords handed down through 3 generations and 3 more graves. They fought the same battles, bled the same blood, but history forgot them, because they didn't dine in castles, they died in ditches, and no bard sang about them. Their loyalty? Don't make me laugh. It wasn't to ideals, it was to land, to gold, to titles that could be passed to their sons, or more often, sold to the highest bidder. Knights didn't swear oaths out of love. They swore them out of hunger, out of desperation, out of ambition, and those oaths could be broken, bought, or burned like anything else in the marketplace of medieval politics. A knight would serve one lord today and stab him in the back tomorrow, if the price was right, and the favor from a richer baron promised enough dirt to bury a future in. They weren't guardians. They were shock troops, the mailed fists of feudal barons who needed someone to swing the sword while they wrote the laws, the vanguard in every skirmish, the hammer that came down on villages that didn't pay enough taxes, the punishment for rebellion, the burning torch that lit up fields in the name of loyalty. When a castle needed defending, they were there. When a border needed breaching, they were there. When a dispute needed blood instead of lawyers, they were the blood. You think the knight stood for justice? No, he stood for order. his master's order. The kind of order that hung men from trees and called it peace, that burned homes to make a political statement, that stomped out hope with iron shoes and called it duty. The knight wasn't a romantic figure. He was a necessary evil, a calculated investment, a moving fortress designed to kill before being killed. And when they weren't on the battlefield, they weren't meditating on honor or rescuing maidens. They were collecting taxes, managing serfs, enforcing the will of their baron or duke or count or king or whoever wore the crown that week. Sometimes they were brutal landlords. Sometimes they were drunks in the great hall. Sometimes they were just bored and dangerous. And for the peasants, those nameless, faceless masses scraping survival out of the mud, it didn't matter what the knight believed, only what he did. And what he did was often violent, petty, and utterly indifferent. This wasn't glory. This wasn't legend. This was reality, gritty, bleeding, screaming. History didn't forget the truth of knights. It erased it, rewrote it, dressed it up in silk and gold, and gave it to you as bedtime comfort, so you wouldn't ask too many questions, so you wouldn't notice the trail of bones beneath the shining banner, so you wouldn't see the rot beneath the polish. But now you know. Knights weren't born in honor. They were forged in war, bred for loyalty, paid in land, released like hunting dogs when politics failed. They weren't heroes. They weren't saviors. They were human. And that, perhaps, is the darkest truth of all. Because a monster in armor is still just a man. And a man with a sword and no mercy. That's not a fairy tale. That's a warning. You think becoming a knight was a glorious journey? A rite of passage wrapped in silk banners and shining opportunity? Think again. There was nothing romantic about the path to knighthood. No one handed you a sword and called you noble. You didn't earn the title through courage. You survived your way to it. And many didn't, because before the armor, before the accolades, before the stories, you were just a child, a terrified, trembling child who was taken from his home and dropped into a world built on pain, a world that would break you, bend you, beat you into the shape of a weapon. Not a man, not a thinker, not a hero, a weapon, a tool, a blade forged in agony and baptized in fear. It started at 7. That's the age. 7 years old. Still small, still soft, still missing teeth and clinging to your mother's skirts. But none of that mattered. The moment your family signed your future away, if you were lucky enough to be born into a house with enough status to even dream of knighthood, you were handed off. You were taken from the warmth of your hearth and dropped into a stranger's castle like a stray dog dumped at a butcher's doorstep. You became a page. That's what they called it. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? But don't be fooled. It was a polite name for institutionalized trauma. Your new home wasn't a school. It was a crucible. You weren't there to learn. You were there to be broken. You served the Lord's family like a servant, often worse than one. You scrubbed floors, fetched armor, fetched wine, fetched whatever the older boys threw at you. You stood in silence for hours. You answered every order without hesitation. You learned to live without comfort, without familiarity, without kindness, because kindness was weakness, and weakness had no place in a knight. There were no bedtime stories, no soft beds, no arms to cry in when the bruises bloomed across your ribs. The only thing waiting for you at the end of the day was exhaustion and the silent terror that tomorrow would be worse. and it usually was. Training began early. Drills that didn't stop. Discipline that didn't waver. Errors were punished. Laziness was punished. Curiosity was punished. You didn't ask questions. You didn't complain. You obeyed. You endured. By the time you were a teenager, if you made it that far, you became a squire. The next step, the next rung up the ladder of suffering. Now you trained with weapons. Real ones, heavy ones. Your body, barely finished growing, was pushed past its limits. Sword drills, horseback drills, shield drills, all under the watchful eyes of knights who knew the cost of failure and had no time for sympathy. You practiced in mud, in snow, in blood. You bled for the sword long before you were ever allowed to wield it in real battle. You were expected to endure broken bones without crying, blisters without rest, nights without sleep, days without food. If you hesitated, you were punished. If you faltered, you were punished. If you cried, you were punished. Pain wasn't just part of the process, it was the process. Because to be a knight wasn't to be brave, it was to be numb. Obedience mattered more than valor, endurance more than ethics. And then came the faith. The church loomed large over every moment of your training. You were taught that your suffering had purpose, that God wanted you to suffer, that pain was purification, that obedience was holy. You prayed in the morning. You prayed before bed. You confessed sins you didn't understand to priests who didn't care. You learned that killing wasn't just acceptable, it was sanctified. That your blade could do God's work as long as it pointed in the right direction. That your enemies were sinners by default, and that your soul could be saved, even as your hands were soaked in blood. Religion wasn't comfort. It was a leash. It was a sword aimed at your thoughts. It taught you that questioning was rebellion, and rebellion was damnation. That your loyalty wasn't just to your Lord, but to the hierarchy itself, to the system that raised you on violence and called it virtue. They didn't raise you to protect the innocent. They raised you to obey the command to kill them, if it came from the right lips. You were not shaped into a symbol. You were forged into a function. When the time finally came for the ceremonial dubbing, for the grand moment when sword tapped shoulder and "Arise, Sir Knight" was spoken, it wasn't a reward. It was a confirmation that you had been hollowed out, that you had been made into what they wanted, that the boy who once cried in the night had been crushed so thoroughly that only steel remained. You didn't stand up because you were worthy. You stood up because you were useful. Your body was strong, your mind was conditioned, your conscience was silenced. You had survived the fire, and what came out was not a man, but a mechanism, a blade in human shape. You were ready to serve, to slaughter, to swear fealty to whichever banner waved the highest that day. So let's not pretend. Let's not pretend that knights were noblemen molded by honor and mercy. Let's not pretend that their journey was one of virtue. The journey to knighthood was a gauntlet of pain. It was isolation. It was indoctrination. It was religious justification sewn into militarized trauma. It was endless drills, endless bruises, and the slow erosion of anything soft, anything human. You were not taught to think. You were taught to submit. You were not raised to question. You were raised to kneel. You were not raised to be honorable. You were forged to obey. And once forged, you were unleashed. On villages, on battlefields, on anyone your master told you to cut down. That was your purpose. That was your training. That was the path. Not glory, not justice, just blood. You've seen the armor. You've imagined the weight, the gleam, the sound of it clanking heroically as the knight steps into battle like some walking god of war. You've seen it on museum mannequins, in fantasy epics, on the pages of books that promise glory, valor, victory. But what you haven't seen, what they never show, is the truth. That inside that glorious suit of medieval armor wasn't a fearless warrior. It was a man suffocating, roasting, drowning in his own sweat, trapped in a coffin made of steel. That armor didn't save lives. It consumed them. Slowly, silently, from the inside out. You weren't wearing the armor. You were being devoured by it. Let's start with the weight. On average, 50 to 60 pounds of iron pressed down on you from the moment it was strapped on. Not evenly, not gently. It crushed your shoulders. It bit into your hips. Your legs had to haul, not just your body, not just your weapon, not just your shield, but a full-body prison that turned every step into a labor. Your breathing grew shallow. Your joints screamed. Your vision narrowed as the visor dropped. You were in the dark, in a furnace, in a trap you willingly climbed into because you had no choice, because your station demanded it, because your lord ordered it, because if you stepped onto that field without it, you'd be skewered in seconds. But here's the twist. The armor didn't protect you. Not the way they told you. Not the way you think. Sure, it could deflect a glancing blow. It might stop an arrow or two. But what it didn't stop was the heat, the weight, the pressure, the pain. You didn't die from the blade. You died before the blade. You died from the inside, from heat stroke, from asphyxiation, from your own heart pounding itself to death in a locked shell of iron. Overheating was constant. Imagine a summer battlefield. No shade, no water, no breaks. Just you, sealed inside a metal oven, breathing hot recycled air through tiny holes in a helmet that smelled like dried blood and old rot. Your sweat didn't evaporate. It collected. It soaked your gambeson, the padded cloth beneath the armor, until it clung to your skin like wet parchment. You weren't just uncomfortable. You were boiling. Your skin blistered. Your muscles weakened. Your body begged for oxygen, but there was none. Not enough. Never enough. And then you fell, because fall you would. Everyone did. One misstep, one shove, one moment of unbalanced footing, and you were down. Not like in the movies. Not dramatically. Awkwardly. Terrifyingly. Like a beetle flipped on its back. And once you were down, getting up was an ordeal that could cost you your life. You weren't agile. You weren't fast. You were a heavy, rattling target. And if no one helped you, you might lie there until your lungs gave out, until your back snapped, until your own armor crushed your ribs, your breath, your final thought. And if you didn't die from the fall, you suffered from what came after. The fractures, the bruising, the muscle tears, the scars. Because the inside of that armor wasn't soft, it was sharp. The metal rubbed your bones raw. The edges cut into your flesh. The straps dug into your shoulders like knives. You'd take the armor off at night, if you could, and find blood where there should have been skin. Bruises like oil spills blooming down your sides. Scabs that never healed. Cuts that never closed. Sanitation? Don't ask. There was none. Once you were armored, you were in it. All day. Through marches. Through fights. Through waiting. Through fear. And when fear took hold, when the adrenaline surged and the bladder failed, you didn't dismount. You didn't ask for a break. You soiled yourself. right there, in your armor. You pissed in your leggings, you shat in your greaves, you marinated in it. And then you kept fighting, or walking, or dying. The smell? Unbearable. You stank like a latrine that had caught fire. Sweat, filth, dried blood, urine, old sores, mildew from the damp padding. You didn't notice it after a while, because you lived in it. Day after day, battle after battle, week after week. You shared it with lice, with fleas, with mold, with everything that thrives in darkness and wetness and heat. You didn't wear armor. You drowned in it. And still, you fought. Because you had no choice. Because taking it off in battle meant death. Because knights were expected to endure, to outlast, to embody strength, even while their bones were screaming, even when their flesh begged for air, even when they couldn't breathe without tasting their own panic, even when their hearts began to fail from the heat, from the pressure, from the fear. Many knights didn't die from wounds. They died from exhaustion, from dehydration, from panic attacks inside their helmets that turned into heart attacks, from strokes, from being unable to breathe fast enough to keep pace with the terror. The real battlefield wasn't always outside the armor. It was inside. Every breath a gamble, every step a test, every moment another chance for the suit to become a tomb. The armor didn't make you invincible. It made you invisible. Hidden, muffled, dehumanized. You weren't a person anymore. You were a silhouette of steel, a thing to be commanded, a tool to be pointed and sent crashing into lines of spears and walls of arrows. And when you fell, when your heart stopped, when your mouth filled with your own vomit because you couldn't breathe or scream or cry, they would pry that armor off of you like a lid off a boiling pot, and find a corpse that never even saw the sword that finished the job. That's what the armor was. Not protection, not honor, not power. It was a cage, a punishment, a sentence you carried with you into every battle, every siege, every moment of agony. The legends will tell you it gleamed, but in truth, it bled. It rusted. It reeked. It crushed the soul before the body ever fell. And the ones who wore it, they didn't stride like heroes. They staggered like prisoners. Because the truth is this: the armor that was meant to save you didn't shield you from death. It simply delayed it long enough for you to feel it coming. And by the time it arrived, you were already gone. You've been lied to. Again, you've been fed images of honor and precision, of knights clashing one-on-one like chess pieces moved by fate, of banners fluttering nobly in the wind while shining heroes gallop across the field toward destiny. You've been told of duels, of codes, of clean victories and righteous deaths, but the real battlefield, the actual medieval battlefield, was not a place of glory. It was a meat grinder, a furnace that melted honor into horror, a place where men went to disappear beneath hooves and screams and blood and were never seen again. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't poetry. It was slaughter. There were no duels, no graceful sword play, no chivalrous challenges answered with nods and formal stances. What you had was chaos, screams and steel and the deafening, endless noise of death being dealt by the ton. Picture this: thousands of bodies shoved together into a moving, thrashing, howling mass of pain and fear. You couldn't see your enemy until he was already in your face. You couldn't hear orders. You couldn't hear your own thoughts. You couldn't even breathe half the time. Not through the stench, not through the panic, not through the blood that sprayed across your face as the man beside you took an axe to the mouth. The ground beneath you? Not grass, not earth. It became mud within minutes, slick, warm and soaked with piss, guts and gore. Men slipped, fell, screamed, vanished under the press of boots and bodies, trampled until their bones snapped and their lungs collapsed. They didn't die fighting. They died beneath the fight, crushed, forgotten, buried alive under the weight of war. There was no direction, no elegance. A knight didn't ride out like a savior. He charged into a mire of terror, swinging blindly in all directions, hoping to kill something before the weight of his armor, or the heat inside it, or the sheer exhaustion of swinging a 30-pound sword for hours, dropped him where he stood. There were no fair fights, no second chances. If you lost your footing, you died. If your helmet twisted, you died. If your horse stumbled, you died. And your death was not dramatic. It was wet, ugly, unseen. The horses screamed, too. That part's always forgotten. But they were there. Massive beasts thrown into battle alongside their riders, panicked and crashing through flesh and wood and steel. They reared and bucked and shrieked like dying giants, their flanks split by spears, their legs snapped by pits, their eyes wide with terror as they were forced to run headfirst into walls of sharpened death. A warhorse wasn't a symbol. It was a casualty, and when it fell, it crushed everything beneath it, friend, foe, or rider. Knights didn't rescue damsels. They crushed skulls for coin, for land, for promises of favor from men who had never touched a sword in their lives. They weren't defenders. They were shock troops, delivered like missiles into enemy lines to shatter bones and morale alike. They were hired blades, and when they rode, they didn't sing. They roared. They trampled. They turned faces into pulp beneath iron hooves. And if they fell, the battlefield showed them no mercy. A knight lying on the ground was a turtle flipped on its back, begging for air as his own armor slowly asphyxiated him in the mud. The last thing he saw wasn't heaven. It was the sole of a boot. And then there were the arrows. Not romantic volleys, not noble archery duels, just waves of jagged wood and steel raining down like the wrath of God. You didn't see them, you heard them, a hiss, a scream, then silence as the man next to you dropped with a shaft buried in his neck, his hands clutching at a hole that no one could stop. You didn't look. You couldn't. You had to keep moving, keep swinging, keep killing, because to pause was to die, and to fall meant you would be stepped on, suffocated, stripped of armor and dignity, and left to rot where you fell. The mud, the blood, the noise, it got into everything, into your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your armor. You bit down and tasted iron and dirt and bile. Your hands blistered and split open from gripping weapons too long. Your arms went numb, your vision blurred. And still you kept going, because the only thing worse than fighting was stopping, because the battlefield didn't forgive a hesitation. It didn't reward skill. It didn't care about courage. It swallowed everything. Some men lost their minds. Others lost their bowels. Fear didn't creep in. It consumed. And the smell. Don't forget the smell. The battlefield stank of shit and blood and the sickening sweetness of spilled organs. You learned to breathe through your mouth until your mouth filled with vomit. And then you didn't breathe at all. You didn't leave the battlefield a hero. You left it changed. If you left it at all, you left missing fingers, teeth, friends. You left dragging the weight of trauma you couldn't name. You left with ears ringing from the screams of men begging for their mothers while they bled out in ditches, whispering final prayers to a God that never came. And when the dust cleared, and the moans of the dying replaced the clash of steel, you didn't celebrate. You collapsed. You dropped your blade because it was too heavy, because your hands were broken, because your soul was cracked. This was not honor. This was not valor. This was not the noble pursuit of justice. This was a nightmare carved into the flesh of history, one battle at a time. And you still want to be a knight? Good. Start by learning how to scream through a slit in your helmet while you drown in someone else's blood. You were taught to believe that knights stood for honor, that they upheld justice, that they were defenders of truth, agents of virtue, wrapped in steel and solemn vows. But peel back the layers of myth and polish, and what do you find? Not a shining protector, but a legally sanctioned monster, a war-trained enforcer, a man with the right, not just the ability, to break your body and end your life without apology. Because in the medieval world, the knight was not a symbol of fairness. He was the instrument of fear. He didn't carry justice in his sword. He carried authority in his fists. And torture wasn't a crime. It was a profession. A knight's word was law. His will, executed through iron, rope, fire, and blade, was unchallenged. Appointed by lords, backed by crowns, and blessed by the church, the knight didn't answer to peasants. He answered to power. And when power told him to extract a confession, secure loyalty, or put on a public display of obedience, he didn't hesitate. He sharpened the tools. He summoned the witnesses. He practiced cruelty the way he practiced sword play, with precision, with ritual, and with pride. Public executions weren't just punishment. They were theater. A knight didn't simply kill, he performed. He staged death like a sermon. Crowds gathered, not to seek justice, but to witness it delivered in screams and blood. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, flayings, each method chosen not for efficiency, but for message. Pain was language, and knights were fluent in it. They understood that suffering wasn't just retribution, it was a warning, a lesson, a spectacle meant to echo through villages and memory alike. And if you think chivalry protected the innocent, think again. Chivalry was a mask, a poem, a lie told in courts to make cruelty look holy. The same knight who spoke of honor could have you tied to a rack the next morning. The same hand that raised a cup to God could twist your limbs out of socket to please a local baron. Honor didn't stop torture. It justified it, wrapped it in procedure, painted it with pageantry. A knight's cruelty was not chaotic. It was practiced, refined, routine. They had tools, so many tools. Racks that pulled bones apart inch by inch, boots that crushed ankles into jelly, thumbscrews that turned joints into paste, iron maidens, branding irons, whips, hooks, chains, weights, torches. Devices built not to kill, but to drag death out until it begged for mercy. And still, no mercy came. Because the knight's goal wasn't to end you, it was to unmake you, to break you open and scoop out your will like rotten fruit. And it wasn't just criminals. It wasn't just heretics. It wasn't just rebels. Anyone could find themselves beneath the knight's gaze. A peasant who refused to pay, a farmer accused of hiding grain, a woman branded a witch for speaking too boldly. There were no trials, only suspicions. There were no lawyers, only screams. There were no appeals, only fire. Because pain wasn't the byproduct of medieval justice. It was the justice. Suffering wasn't collateral, it was the goal, and knights were its administrators. They trained for it. They studied it. They understood the breaking points of human flesh better than any healer. They knew how long a man could hang before his lungs collapsed, how much pressure a knee could take before it snapped sideways, how many lashes it took before a back became red soup. They didn't flinch. They didn't pause. They learned. Pain was their lesson book, and people were the parchment. And when the work was done, when the body lay in pieces, when the blood pooled thick, when the crowd had screamed or wept or fallen silent, they didn't feel guilt. They felt order. They believed they had restored balance, that by torturing one, they had controlled 1,000. Fear was efficient, and the night was its perfect delivery system. This wasn't justice. This was control. It wasn't about who deserved punishment. It was about who needed to be seen being punished. Knights weren't defenders. They were deterrents, living reminders of what would happen to anyone who disobeyed, who defied, who dreamed too loudly, and they didn't shy from it. They embraced it, because cruelty in the medieval world was a kind of currency, and knights were always rich in it. They didn't ask if it was right. They asked who ordered it. They didn't wonder if it would work. They knew it would. A broken man tells the truth, or at least the version of truth that keeps his fingers intact. And that was enough. So forget what you've been told. Forget the roses and the oaths and the noble causes. Chivalry was for the bards. Reality was for the battlefield and the dungeon. And in the dungeons of medieval Europe, knights weren't heroes. They were executioners in slow motion, lords of pain, craftsmen of agony, soldiers with steel in their hands and silence in their hearts. This was not the age of gallantry. It was the age of cruelty. And the knight stood at its center, polished, powerful, and perfectly prepared to make you beg for a death he might not grant. They told you knights were protectors, guardians of virtue, champions of the weak. They wrapped them in cloaks of chivalry, spoke of sacred vows, painted images of men who'd rather die than dishonor a woman. But behind the banners, behind the armor, behind the myths carefully penned by court poets and church scribes, there was a darker story, one that never made it into the ballads, one that no one sings. Because the truth is this: knights were not protectors. They were predators. And for countless women, their arrival didn't mean rescue. It meant ruin. Let's strip the fantasy to the bone. In the medieval world, power was everything. And knights had power. They had the sword, the land, the law, and they used all three to get what they wanted, including women. Especially women. Because to the knight, women weren't people. They were property, dowries, commodities, spoils of war, breeding stock. If you were a peasant woman, you didn't have rights. You had a body, and that body could be taken, bruised, broken, with no one to defend you, no one to believe you, no one to care. There was no sanctuary in your home. Knights could take what they pleased. It wasn't even considered theft. It was custom. They were agents of the Lord, defenders of the realm, but more often they were enforcers of male entitlement. The right of the first night, the so-called custom that allowed nobles to sleep with a common bride before her husband, wasn't just legend. It happened. Maybe not in every village. Maybe not every wedding. But the fear was real. And fear didn't need to be universal, to be absolute. If the night arrived, no one stopped him. If he came to your door, the only thing you could do was pray and hide. and hope that this time he was drunk enough to forget you. And if you resisted, if you screamed or scratched or said no, then the night reminded you what steel felt like, not just on your skin, but in your soul, because your pain didn't matter. Your husband couldn't defend you. He'd be killed for trying. Your father couldn't intervene. He'd lose his land. Your church couldn't help. It was filled with men who feared the night more than they feared sin. And so you endured. Or you didn't. Some women vanished after the night's visit. Some were found hanging from barn beams. Some simply faded into silence, forced to carry the weight of a violation that no one would name. And the horror wasn't reserved for peasants. Even noble women, women with status, with titles, with castles and coats of arms, weren't safe. Their honor was a currency traded between fathers and husbands. A girl's virginity was not hers. It was a bargaining chip, a political tool, an object of transaction. And if a knight wanted her, if he had the favor of the court, the approval of a king, the silence of a bishop, then her consent was irrelevant. Her body was his battlefield, her name his prize. And when it happened, and it did, over and over, across centuries, the woman was the one punished. She was shamed, hidden, married off in haste, locked away in a convent, disowned, blamed, because honor wasn't about her, it was about them. Her purity reflected the men around her, and once it was lost, by force, by violence, by betrayal, they considered her ruined. Never him. Always her. Some women tried to escape. They fled to monasteries, to remote abbeys, to stone-cold cells filled with prayer and fear. But even there, the night's shadow followed. Convents weren't fortresses. They were targets, raided in times of war, broken into during chaos, filled with terrified girls who thought holiness could protect them, and learned instead that God's silence was louder than screams. And let's talk about the silence. The vast, endless, choking silence that blanketed these crimes. The myths didn't mention the bruises. The songs skipped over the torn linens. The poems praised the knight's loyalty, his bravery, his mercy, but never asked who paid the price for his legend. Because she couldn't speak. She wasn't allowed to. Her voice was erased, her story swallowed, her body remembered only by the pain it carried in secret. That's the truth. Knights were not the saviors of women. They were the storm that shattered them, the blade that turned beauty into burden, the force that carved obedience into flesh. Their heroism was built on bruises. Their nobility floated on a sea of silenced screams. Chivalry was not a shield. It was a curtain, pulled over centuries of cruelty, a polished lie used to decorate the very men who caused the suffering. It spoke of protecting the weak, but only if they were worth protecting. Only if their father owned land. Only if their family had gold. If you were poor, if you were powerless, if you were born into mud instead of marble, you were invisible, you were available, you were already claimed. So stop imagining the knight as the shining savior. Start seeing him as he was, a product of violence, a practitioner of fear, a man trained to take and taught to believe that God and crown approved. Because for every story of rescue, there are 1,000 stories of rape. For every tale of honor, a graveyard of secrets. And for every hero crowned in legend, there was a woman left bleeding in the dark. You see a knight with a cross on his chest and you think, faith, devotion, righteousness. You imagine a warrior of God, forged in virtue, sworn to protect the innocent and uphold divine justice. But the truth is that cross wasn't a symbol of salvation. It was a target, a brand, a declaration, not of peace, but of war. A warning to all who saw it that the man wearing it had been given permission to kill in the name of heaven. And he would, without mercy, without guilt, because the knight didn't just serve a king, he served God. And God, in the medieval world, wasn't love. God was fire. The church didn't stop the violence. It blessed it, sanctified it, gave it robes and rituals and called it holy. The Pope didn't ask knights to lay down their swords. He told them to raise them higher, because the church didn't just tolerate bloodshed. It weaponized it, turned every battlefield into a sermon, every corpse into a conversion, every drop of blood into a sacrament. And the knights obeyed. Not because they were forced, because they were rewarded. Because heaven was promised, not to the meek, but to the militant. The Crusades weren't missions of faith. They were campaigns of annihilation. Entire cities burned while men screamed God's name. Not mercy, not justice, just purification through steel. Knights marched to the Holy Land not to spread the gospel, but to claim it, with swords, with fire, with bones piled high in the streets of Jerusalem. They didn't offer salvation, they offered butchery, and the church called it divine. You didn't have to understand Latin, you just had to bleed the wrong color, worship the wrong way, live on the wrong land. Because if you were Muslim, Jew, heretic, even Christian from the wrong region, you were marked. And the knight's blade didn't care about scripture. It cared about orders, and the church gave them freely. Kill them all. God will know his own. Children were not spared. Women were not spared. The church claimed holy war, and the knight delivered. He kicked open doors in cities he didn't know, cut down men he didn't speak to, and called it righteousness. This wasn't justice. It was religious genocide dressed in chainmail and cloaked in ritual. When they stormed cities, they didn't purify. They massacred, and the streets ran red. Not in metaphor. In fact, the sword didn't baptize with water. It cleansed with flame, with arrows, with the cracking of skulls beneath the boots of armored men who believed they were cleansing the world of impurity. And the church cheered them on, promised indulgences, forgiveness, eternal reward. Heaven was not earned by kindness. It was bought with murder. Kill for the cross and be blessed. Slaughter the infidel, and your soul is saved. The more you bled others, the closer you got to paradise. And it wasn't just in distant deserts. It was in Europe, in the forests, in the mountains. Heretics were hunted like animals, dragged from homes, burned alive in public squares while priests sang hymns. Knights didn't flinch. They held the torches. They manned the pyres. They guarded the prisoners as they screamed and begged and blistered into ash. Because this wasn't punishment. It was correction. It was purification by pain. It was the holy duty of the righteous to erase the unclean. Torture became a language of faith, a conversation between steel and skin. They broke bones with prayers on their lips. They drove nails through flesh while quoting the Psalms. They turned confession into a performance of agony. If you screamed loud enough, you were forgiven. If you died fast enough, you were clean. And if you resisted, if you dared to claim your God, your belief, your difference, you were cast into fire. Not after death, during it. And always, always the knight stood beside the priest, not behind him, beside him, as equal instruments of divine judgment. One held the book, the other held the blade. One promised grace, the other delivered terror. They weren't opposites. They were a team. One whispered salvation. The other enforced it. The knight didn't wear the cross out of reverence. He wore it as license. It meant I kill for heaven. It meant I am above question. It meant my sword is sanctified. Faith was not a restraint. It was fuel, and steel became gospel. They didn't preach. They punished. They didn't heal. They hunted. They didn't forgive. They crucified. In villages, on roadsides, in holy lands turned to slaughter fields, and behind every act the church stood smiling. Because for them, violence wasn't sin. It was service, a necessary fire to burn away the unbelievers, a sacred purge. So stop imagining the knight as a holy protector. Stop imagining the church as a gentle guide. In the medieval world, their alliance was not built on peace. It was built on fire and death, on the screams of the guilty and the innocent alike, on the belief that murder could be holy, that brutality could be blessed, that a sword could become a sacrament in the right hand. The knight didn't serve God with prayer. He served God with fire, with steel, and with the shattered bodies of those who dared to pray differently. That wasn't piety. That was war in a robe. That was judgment in armor. That was the cross not as salvation, but as a target painted in blood. You've seen the paintings. The final charge, the sunlight glinting off a polished sword, the gallant knight, face calm, blade raised, ready to meet death in some glorious whirlwind of courage and cause. But that's a fairy tale. That's what the scribes wrote to please the kings. That's what the bards sang to soothe the widows. That's what history turned into gold to cover up the stink of rot. Because the real death of a knight didn't come on the battlefield. It came days earlier, in a muddy camp next to a rotting tent with an empty stomach and a fever that burned holes in the mind. It came quietly. It came slowly. It came disgustingly. You want to know the truth? Knights didn't die screaming in glory. They died coughing in filth. Start with the food. Rotting meat. Bread so stale you had to break it with a dagger. Grain infested with black beetles. Cheese curdled into a yellow brick of disease. And that was on a good day. On a bad one, there was nothing. No flour, no forage, no spoils. Just a crust scavenged from a burned village, or the guts of a horse too sick to carry weight. The knights starved more often than they fought. They sucked marrow from bones. They drank from puddles shared with oxen and rats. They chewed raw onions like apples to kill the taste of their own breath. And that breath reeked, not from poor hygiene, but from rot, from teeth blackened by neglect and infection, from stomachs filled with rancid fat and unwashed hands, from guts crawling with worms and parasites. Because when you eat filth, you breed it. Dysentery was constant. Fevers swept through camps like smoke through a broken chimney. Vomiting, shaking, shitting blood into the mud, and then being expected to ride the next day. Water? Contaminated. Always. Ponds were piss bowls. Wells were death traps. Streams ran dark with the waste of armies. So they drank beer. Warm, sour beer, or wine that tasted like vinegar, or worse, nothing. And still they marched. Still they fought. Still they rotted alive beneath the banners of kings who never saw their faces. And what about their armor? You think it was protection? Under that steel skin was hell, fleas, ticks, boils, and blood. The pattern beneath was never washed. It held the sweat of months, the vomit of illness, the blood of injury, the stench of infection. Rashes turned to open wounds, wounds filled with maggots. And the maggots? Sometimes the only thing keeping the rot from spreading. Sometimes the only line between agony and death. There was no medical care, not really. A knife heated in fire, a cup of wine to numb the soul, a tourniquet made of someone else's belt. Surgery meant amputation. Cleanliness meant wiping the blade on your sleeve. Infection wasn't a risk. It was an eventuality. A small cut from a splintered arrow could bloom into a death sentence within days. And no one stopped to mourn. No one stopped at all. They buried the feverish under piles of snow or left them where they fell, bones picked clean by crows who knew knights not as heroes, but as meat. Poison was common, not the glamorous kind, not goblets and plots and royal intrigue, the kind you drank by accident because the stew had spoiled, because the river was fouled by a dead animal 2 miles upstream, because the mold in your bread had turned toxic and your body couldn't take it anymore. Knights curled up in their tents at night, clutching their bellies, praying to gods who didn't answer, and shit themselves into oblivion, dying not with swords in their hands, but curled in straw, hallucinating, twitching, forgotten. Their mouths cracked, their feet blistered, their hands swelled from infection, and still they were told to keep riding, keep fighting, keep dying, because that was their duty, their function, their fate. The grave didn't come with a trumpet. It came with a cough that wouldn't stop, a cough that turned to blood, then to silence. The knight didn't die roaring on the battlefield. He died alone, in the dark, with his armor beside him and a prayer unfinished on his lips. His final breath smelled of rot. His final sight was not of glory, but of mold on the canvas above him. His final sound was not the clash of arms, but the wet gurgle of his own lungs filling with liquid. And then someone took his boots. Someone took his coin. Someone stripped his body for parts before the worms did. That was knighthood. Hunger, rot, and death without glory. Not a legend. A waste. A slow-motion disintegration of men who were never heroes. Just flesh pushed too far, used too long, and discarded too quickly. The battlefield didn't need swords to kill them. Just time. Just filth. Just a cut left unclean. That was enough. So remember, the next time someone tells you of the knight's nobility, ask them how many maggots it takes to clean a wound. Ask them how long it takes to starve in a tent while wearing a symbol of honor. Ask them what kind of glory ends in diarrhea and flies, because that's where the story really ends. Not in marble, not in myth, but in mud. They say knights were loyal, that they stood by their kings, their oaths, their brothers in arms, that once they swore fealty, their honor held firm, unshakable, eternal. But that, like everything else about knighthood, is a lie coated in silver leaf and sealed in song. The truth is darker, rotten, human, because under the iron, under the vows, under the so-called chivalric code, knights were players in a blood-soaked game of power, and the only rule was survival. And in that game, loyalty was worth less than a purse of gold. Oaths crumbled faster than old stone, and the sharper the blade, the deeper the betrayal. Knights betrayed kings, again and again, not by accident, not in desperation, but with calculation, with planning, with full awareness of what it meant. Whole knightly orders, sacred institutions wrapped in holy vows, turned on their monarchs the moment it suited them. They formed alliances behind castle walls. They met under banners of peace and whispered plans of war. They smiled in council chambers while arranging assassinations. They raised goblets in toasts while sharpening daggers behind their backs. Honor. It died the second gold entered the room. Brothers poisoned each other for inheritance. Friends ambushed each other at border crossings. Pages grew up into squires and murdered the very knights who trained them. A crown was never safe, a throne never stable, because every knight in the hall might be the last face a king ever saw. Treachery wore a polished helm and rode a destrier like the rest. It spoke fluent, courtly language and knelt when required. And then it struck. Allegiances were smoke. They drifted wherever the wind of power blew. One day, a knight stood as guardian to a lord. The next, he was riding at the front of an army raised to burn that lord's castle to the ground. They changed sides like cloaks, swore new oaths with the same lips that betrayed the last ones, and the justifications always ready. The old master was weak, corrupt. God had revealed a new path. The people needed saving. But in the end, it was always about land, about coin, about leverage. Spies wore armor, too. Don't be fooled by the clash and the banners. Intelligence won wars, and knights knew it. They carried letters tucked inside greaves, delivered secrets between rival courts under cover of diplomatic escort. They eavesdropped in tents. They reported to bishops while pretending to serve dukes. They moved through halls like shadows with shining boots. The sword wasn't just for killing. It was for threatening, for persuading, for reminding people that the knight who laughed beside you at supper might be the last thing you see before the lights go out. And the noblest, the most decorated, the ones whose names appear in stained glass and royal chronicles, they were often the worst, because the higher you climbed, the more knives were required. There's no such thing as clean power, only well-hidden crimes. And those knights who stood closest to kings had blood on their hands, measured in rivers. They orchestrated coups, arranged false confessions, staged accidents, delivered poison in goblets or quiet blades in dark halls. They didn't charge into battle. They shaped the battle before it ever began. Politics wasn't separate from war. It was war. Every smile was a trap, every gift a test, every banquet a battlefield. And the sword? It wasn't just a weapon. It was a contract. It could silence dissent. It could enforce debt. It could turn fear into obedience. Knights knew this, used it, mastered it. And the ones who didn't? The idealists, the truly loyal, they ended up in unmarked graves with traitor carved into memory by men who needed a scapegoat. And don't think this ended when battles did. After peace was signed, after lords embraced and kissed rings, the real war continued. In letters, in bedchambers, in whispered meetings by candlelight. A knight could win glory on the field and lose everything the next morning if he backed the wrong faction, if he held the wrong title, if he owed the wrong man a favor. Titles were stripped, lands confiscated, heads removed, and behind every twist in the knife there was another knight holding the hilt. The entire system of nobility was a machine of betrayal. Everyone knew it. Everyone participated, and everyone pretended otherwise. That's why the myths are so powerful, because they cover the stench. They hide the truth that knighthood was not about honor. It was about positioning, about climbing, about power. And in that climb, you stepped over corpses, you made enemies disappear, and you lied with a straight face until your last breath. So forget the brotherhood. Forget the loyalty. Forget the sacred vows and glorious ends. The knight was a player in a game that never ended, and he played to win, not to serve, not to protect, not to uphold truth, but to survive, to thrive, to take. And when he finally fell, when the intrigue turned on him, when his allies vanished, when the same dagger he'd used a dozen times found his own back, there were no songs, no mourning, only silence. The kind of silence that follows a deal completed, a threat removed. This wasn't a world of heroes. It was a chessboard soaked in blood, and knights were never pawns. They were assassins in armor, smiling as they moved. They say the Templars were holy, that they were chosen, that they took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and lived lives of humble service, swords in hand, crosses on chest, guarding pilgrims on dusty roads to sacred cities. They say they were defenders of the faith, protectors of the innocent, martyrs to a world that no longer understood honor. But that's only the beginning of the story, and the beginning is always cleaner than the end, because the Templars didn't stay humble, they didn't stay small, they didn't stay controllable. And when knights stop taking orders and start writing ledgers, when men of the cloth start counting gold instead of prayers, when swords are traded for vaults and vows for influence, empires are born. And empires don't die in silence. They die in flames. The Knights Templar began as little more than bodyguards, armed monks, a few zealots with swords and no money, stationed in Jerusalem to protect travelers who might otherwise fall to thieves, raiders, or worse. They slept on the ground, ate whatever was handed to them, owned nothing, answered to God and to one another. And for a time, that was enough. For a time, they were exactly what the Church wanted them to be, symbols of purity in an age of rot. But purity doesn't last. Power never lets it. The pilgrims needed more than protection. They needed banking, safe passage, places to rest, to store valuables, to move money across vast and dangerous lands. And the Templars were there, always there, watching, listening, learning, and so they adapted. They began keeping accounts, offering loans, charging interest without calling it interest, building outposts, then strongholds, then entire fortresses that housed not just men, but coin, scrolls, property, secrets. They went from ragged monks to armored administrators, from guards to lenders, from defenders to owners. Their network stretched across continents. Their influence seeped into courts, cathedrals, and crowns. They became more than a military order. They became a financial system wrapped in scripture. They funded kings. They brokered truces. They stored the wealth of empires and guarded it like dragons in white cloaks. And all of it was hidden, behind stone walls, in foreign tongues, in coded ledgers and sealed vaults. The Templars prayed in public but counted in private. They held deeds to lands they never visited. They controlled access to riches they didn't spend. They answered to no king, no bishop, no army, only the Pope, and eventually, not even him. Because you can't serve God and gold forever. One always wins. By the late 13th century, they were no longer monks. They were merchants in mail, warriors of the word who could bankrupt a nation with a whisper. They weren't feared because they fought. They were feared because they owned. Castles, ports, routes, armies. They had their own laws, their own courts, their own agenda, and kings began to notice, especially one. Philip IV of France owed the Templars money. A lot of money, enough to make a king nervous, enough to make a desperate man dangerous. He couldn't erase the debt, but he could erase the creditor. So he made his move, not with swords, with accusations, heresy, idolatry, sodomy, black magic, worship of false gods, secret rites, spitting on the cross, kissing in dark halls. The charges were wild, deliberate, designed not to prove guilt, but to justify destruction. Because Philip didn't need to be right. He needed to be feared. And the only thing scarier than an untouchable order of holy warriors was what might happen if they stopped serving him. So the arrests began. Dawn raids, chains, shackles, men dragged from prayer to prison, their properties seized, their accounts frozen, their records burned, their identities smeared. The very knights who once held the line against enemies of Christendom were now branded as enemies themselves. And then came the torture. Not war, wires and fire, racks, blades, thumbs crushed into powder, teeth shattered, bones broken for confessions. They screamed, they wept, they bled, and the Inquisition recorded every word. Under agony, some admitted everything. Most admitted anything. Because when your skin is peeled from your back, truth becomes whatever your torturer wants it to be. And then came the fires, whole pyres lit not in pagan villages, but in the heart of Europe. Paris, London, Rome. Templar knights burned alive, slow, public, symbolic, their white cloaks blackening as the flames consumed them. They died silent, or they died screaming. It didn't matter. The world had already decided they were monsters, or worse, liabilities. But they weren't destroyed for sin. They were destroyed for power. Because they had too much. Because they stood above the crown and below the Pope, and that made them untouchable, unkillable. So they were made killable, slandered, demonized, executed, their gold absorbed, their lands divided, their secrets buried. And yet the legend never faded. How could it? These weren't ordinary men. These were the architects of a hidden empire. Their fingerprints were everywhere, on vault doors, on papal decrees, on the very concept of international banking. And when they died, the world they helped build didn't. It just shifted, adapted, grew. Some say they hid their wealth, that it lies beneath cathedrals or mountains or behind false walls in forgotten monasteries. Some say they faked their own destruction, that the order lived on under new names, new banners, new missions. Others say the Templars never needed to survive, because what they created became too deeply rooted to erase. They started with nothing but swords and faith. They ended with everything. And when kings grew jealous, when power trembled, when the smoke of fear thickened, those kings did not destroy monsters. They destroyed rivals. So remember, the Templars didn't fall because they were wicked. They fell because they were wealthy, because they were independent, because they were too powerful to tolerate and too influential to control. And in a world ruled by crowns and crosses, there is only one fate for those who walk between them: fire. Once, the knight was fear, steel on horseback, death with a banner. Once, the clank of armor meant everything: order, domination, law. When a knight rode through a village, people knelt, prayed, or ran. He was power in motion. He was authority forged in fire. But time doesn't care about myths. Time shreds armor. Time laughs at oaths. And when it was done with the knight, it didn't just erase him, it humiliated him. Because the fall of the knight wasn't slow. It wasn't graceful. It was violent. It was absurd. It was final. Gunpowder didn't just change the battlefield. It made the knight irrelevant. All the training, the rituals, the code of chivalry, the ceremonies, the polished armor, the horses bred for battle. It meant nothing the moment a man with a musket could kill you from behind a bush. No glory, no duel, just a puff of smoke and a hole in your chest before your name even reached the enemy's ears. Bullets didn't care about bloodlines. They didn't care how many tournaments you'd won. They didn't care how shiny your breastplate was. They pierced steel like it was paper and turned warriors into corpses before the sword even left its scabbard. Cannons mocked castles. Fortresses that once took years to besiege fell in hours. Walls cracked. Towers crumbled. Knights standing atop parapets found themselves buried beneath them. No charge, no last stand, just thunder, fire, and rubble. A whole class of warriors brought to their knees, not by better fighters, but by physics, by chemistry, by the simple, terrifying fact that courage couldn't stop explosives. The knight had no answer. His sword was too short, his armor too slow, his warhorse too expensive, and so the generals took over. The musketeers marched in lines, the cannons were wheeled forward. Bureaucrats planned campaigns with ink and maps, not blood and guts. Orders came from desks now, not from saddlebacks. The knight was no longer needed. The age of individual valor was over. The age of machines had begun. What did the knights do? Some tried to adapt. They became mercenaries, sold their blades to the highest bidder, fought in wars they didn't understand, for pay they rarely received. They weren't respected. They were used, disposable, tools in conflicts bigger than them. Others clung to titles long after the world stopped caring, rode through villages expecting bows and fealty, and were greeted with laughter. Their armor rusted, their castles emptied, their names turned into punchlines. They weren't defenders anymore. They were relics. Some begged, yes, begged, stripped of land, purpose, and relevance. Many once feared knights found themselves without food, without coin, without cause. They wandered, slept in barns, drank away the last echoes of glory, told stories of battles no one remembered to children who didn't believe them. Their greatness didn't fade. It exploded, shattered by the very march of time they thought they could outride. And those who stayed? They were turned into parades, costumed mascots for kings who no longer needed them, trotted out at festivals, decorated in lace and feathers, staged mock battles for cheering crowds who didn't fear them but mocked them. The armor, once sacred, became costume. The sword, once feared, became prop. They became entertainment, statues, paintings, fairy tales. Because in the end, that's what the knight became. Not a soldier, not a symbol of power, but a story, told to children, sold to tourists, frozen in stained glass and forgotten in policy. The battlefield moved on, and the knight was left standing alone, outdated, overburdened, and completely out of place. He wasn't killed in battle. He was retired by history, replaced by the march of boots, the roar of cannons, and the ticking of clocks in war rooms he'd never be allowed to enter. No last charge, no heroic end. Just silence, just rust, just a name in a book, a suit of armor in a museum, and a question on the lips of every new age. Did they really matter? And the truth? Not anymore. They weren't heroes, but we made them so. Not because they earned it, not because they deserved it, but because we needed them to be. We needed knights in shining armor, guardians of virtue, paragons of honor, because the truth was too ugly, too bloody, too real. So we rewrote it. We took the killers, the enforcers, the butchers in steel, and we polished them with poetry. We dipped them in golden glory and called it history. We carved monsters into marble and passed the statues down as truth. And thus, the myth was born, not discovered, but constructed. Deliberate, strategic, beautiful, and completely false. It didn't start in battle, it started in verse. Romantic poets were the architects of this illusion. They took the mud-caked, lice-infested, disease-ridden warriors of the medieval killing fields and dressed them in silk words. They turned blades into symbols, blood into sacrifice, and death into destiny. King Arthur, Lancelot, the Round Table, the Holy Grail, fiction, fairy tales recited so often they hardened into memory. These weren't historical records, they were escapes, and we clung to them because reality was unbearable. By the time Victorian England arrived, the myth was no longer a lie. It was an institution, a tool. The empire needed purity. It needed nobility. It needed to believe in its own righteousness. So it resurrected the knight as a mirror of its own ideal, the image of the loyal servant, the moral soldier, the gallant protector of order. It took centuries of conquest and wrapped them in chivalry. It took colonial violence and disguised it as duty. They taught boys in school to idolize knights while sending their fathers to die in foreign trenches. They called it patriotism, but it was just propaganda in armor, and the tools of the myth kept growing. Literature, theater, opera, art. Knights were everywhere, but not as they were, as they should have been. Noble, brave, pure. The blood was erased, the screams silenced, the atrocities edited out like footnotes in a story told too many times to bother questioning. The knight became a costume, a metaphor, a logo, and then came cinema. Movies didn't just inherit the lie, they perfected it. Hollywood turned knights into superheroes. Shiny plate armor, clean swords, perfect beards, damsels rescued, dragons slain, evil defeated with honor and glory. Not one speck of dirt, not one moment of moral ambiguity, not one whisper of the reality they buried. The suffering, the corruption, the brutality, all gone, all replaced with fantasy and orchestral soundtracks. Then came video games, interactive myth-making. Now you were the knight. You could ride, fight, rescue, rule. You could cleanse the land of evil with a single swing of your sword. You didn't see the plague, the burning villages, the tortured prisoners, the starving peasants. Just quests and XP, loot and valor, and it was fun. Too fun. And that was the final twist of the knife. Not only was the myth a lie, we paid for it, downloaded it, shared it, made it our own. We didn't just believe the lie, we wanted to believe it. Because it's comforting, because it makes us feel like history was clean, that there was a time when good men wore steel and did the right thing, that evil was simple, that justice had a face and a sword. But the real knight didn't carry justice. He carried orders. He didn't rescue the helpless. He enforced the powerful. The real knight didn't live in Camelot. He lived in filth. He killed for coin. He died from rot. And no poem can change that. But the myth marches on. Every time a child picks up a plastic sword, every time a film casts a knight in radiant armor with a perfect jawline, every time a history book skips over the pain to get to the glory, every time we look at the Middle Ages and see adventure instead of horror. That's how the myth survives. Not by truth, by repetition, by omission, by elegance, and in doing so, we lose something. We lose the truth of what power did to people. We lose the warning. Because the myth isn't harmless. It tells us to admire the wrong things, to salute violence when it's dressed in etiquette, to excuse conquest when it's coated in ritual, to forget the bodies in the mud while we cheer the man on the horse. The knight as we know him was never real. He was made, forged in ink and illusion. The armor, costume, the honor, invention, the glory, painted over blood, and the myth, a mirror, showing us not who they were, but who we still pretend to be. So ask yourself, do you really want the truth? Or are you too in love with the lie? So now you know. Or at least, you've seen behind the curtain. The gleam of the armor is gone. The fairy tale has crumbled into ash, and all that's left is the weight of the question that history has spent centuries avoiding. Was the knight ever a hero at all? Not in stories, not in songs, but in truth, in fact. In the dirt and blood of the world they ruled and ruined. Strip away the poetry, forget the parades. Look at the bones beneath the banners. Was this figure of legend ever noble, or just necessary? Was he ever brave, or just brutal? Did he ever fight for justice, or only for land, coin, and the praise of men who would send him to die without blinking? Maybe he was both. Maybe that's the tragedy, that every sword swung in defense carved through someone else's future, that every vow of honor ended in silence for those who couldn't speak, that every victory sung through stained glass was bought with a village burned to the ground. The knight wasn't just a man. He was a system, a symbol, a tool, and tools can be sharpened for good or forged for conquest. But ask yourself, why did we make him into more? Why did we choose to remember the roses and forget the thorns? Why did we write tales of grace and gallantry when the ground was soaked in screams? Was it nostalgia, propaganda, or guilt? Did we turn monsters into heroes because we needed to believe that blood could be beautiful? And if the night was a lie, what else have we lied about? The code of chivalry, that elegant list of virtues, we're told, separated the knight from the brute. What was it really? A moral compass? Or a cage for the weak? A justification for control? A way to turn obedience into holiness, violence into virtue, and oppression into ceremony? Chivalry didn't elevate men. It tamed them, trained them, pointed them like weapons, and then called the results noble. There are more truths to face, more myths to burn. The story isn't over. It never was, because the knight may have vanished from the battlefield, but the idea remains, polished, glorified, dangerous. So now, the silence is yours, and the next question waits. Who are today's knights, and what are they hiding?